I must first thank the Harvard Growth Lab at the Kennedy School for inviting me to be part of their series of development talks. And a particular word of thanks to Tim and Patricio, and of course, greetings to Ricardo, who I had the great privilege of meeting when the Harvard team was working in Sri Lanka. So it's a pleasure to be with you. And let me, what I'm trying to do this afternoon is to give you initially a historical perspective of macro developments in Sri Lanka to make the case that macroeconomic stress was arguably the most important contributory factor in holding back Sri Lanka's development. And then to make the case for clear frameworks for macroeconomic policymaking and embedding those frameworks as far as possible in law. That's what we tried to do. Not totally successfully, I should add. It was a work in progress when the government changed, and now I think the pandemic has distracted everybody. So let me start. A bit of background on Sri Lanka. I don't know how much the audience knows about Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, at the time of independence in 1948, was second to Japan in Asia on most socioeconomic indicators. In fact, Lee Kuan Yew called Sri Lanka the modern model post-colonial country in the early 50s. He came to change his mind and in fact drew lessons from Sri Lanka on what not to do when he became Prime Minister of Singapore. So what about the early years? The early years of post-independence Sri Lanka, there was significant progress made in terms of social development. Sri Lanka has a very vaunted record of social development on any social indicator, whether it is life expectancy, infant and maternal mortality, the performance on the MDGs, and now the performance on the SDGs. Sri Lanka punches above its weight. But in terms of growth and wealth creation, the record is far less impressive. So having been second to Japan at the time of independence on most indicators, Sri Lanka has slipped well down the pecking order as far as Asian countries are concerned, particularly in relation to countries in East and Southeast Asia. So what has happened? Let me first start by identifying three mega challenges which are still out there, which the Sri Lankan policymakers need to get their heads around if we are to make significant progress. One is to have a better balance between social development and wealth creation. As I said, on most social indicators, Sri Lanka outperforms. And there is a narrative sometimes you hear in Sri Lanka saying, look, why, in terms of our culture, we're a predominantly Buddhist country, should we be chasing growth as vigorously as others? Should we not be happy that we have a reasonable quality of life? But if you look at what has happened, particularly after 1971, the developments in the country question the validity of that narrative. We have had 2 youth insurrections in the south of the country and a separatist movement in the north. And while there's been complex social, political, and economic causality, in my view, the most significant causal factor has been the mismatch between aspirations and expectations. The economy was good at educating young people. People were getting through formal education, boys and girls, but it wasn't creating the opportunities for them in terms of gainful employment. And that mismatch led to these violent upheavals. Thousands of young people died in the part of, the northern separatist movement had an ethnic layer to it. The southern insurrections in 71 and 88, 90 was primarily, in my view, economic. So clearly it's not enough to say, you have good social indicators, so that should be the end of the story as far as your development agenda is concerned. We need to do better in terms of creating gainful employment and wealth as far as Sri Lankans are concerned. So that's one kind of challenge. How do you get a better balance between social development and wealth creation in the country? The second challenge is the graduation of Sri Lanka from low-income country status. Sri Lanka was a donor darling for many years because it was the second country after Chile to liberalize its economy. Of those countries that went down the autarkic route, Sri Lanka was the second country after Chile to liberalize its economy. And the traditional donors and Japan is a traditional donor, sorry, the traditional donors were very keen to demonstrate good development outcomes in a country with a liberal economy and a liberal polity. Clearly, Chile in the early stages did not have a liberal polity, whereas Sri Lanka had both. And so in their desire to show good outcomes in a country with these two characteristics, they were extremely generous in terms of ODA flows to Sri Lanka, which was not entirely helpful. It meant that the kind of fiscal discipline that is necessary to create sound macro fundamentals on which sustained growth can be built was never achieved and still hasn't been achieved. And then what happened was the country graduated. The end of the graduation process was about 7-8 years ago, and Sri Lanka lost access to concessional ODA. For many years, it got close to 5% of GDP as ODA flows, and almost all of it was highly concessional. 60% or more came from the IDA from World Bank and the Asian Development Fund in the Asian ADB. So these were the concessional windows of these institutions. So we're talking about 40-year money, 10-year grace period, under 1% administration costs. That's the kind of money Sri Lanka was getting at kind of, as I say, a cost of below 1%. So, and amounting to about 5% of GDP. So this was really the kind of infusion of external support, infusion of external savings that the economy enjoyed. And unfortunately, the balance, as I said, between strengthening the growth framework and spending it on social welfare was not achieved. In fact, Professor Joan Robinson, who is of course a left-leaning economist, when she came to Sri Lanka in the 1960s, said, you folks have eaten the fruit before you planted the tree. And I think that's the best kind of description of what has happened in Sri Lanka over the last 70 years. So that's, and once we graduated, we were fortunate in the sense that at the time we lost this concessional funding, the global financial crisis took place, and there was a massive amount of liquidity pumped into the international system, and the money was looking for high yield. Sri Lanka did not have any exposure to commercial debt at that time, and therefore there was headroom to borrow, and we borrowed quite vigorously, and we were not very discriminating in the way we spent that money. The money went into non-tradables. The money did not generate or save foreign exchange repayment, and that in some ways is the genesis of the serious debt problem that Sri Lanka is facing today. So, and the other thing is that as policymakers, we have had difficulty in accepting and getting our head around the discipline that is imposed by access to international capital markets and being subjected to the scrutiny of rating agencies. That is something we have not really come around to working out, and the discipline that has to come with it still hasn't appeared. So that's the kind of background, and in terms of three kind of macro challenges. I'm sorry, the third macro challenge is that Sri Lanka, and this, I don't know how many other countries have this kind of phenomenon, is experiencing its demographic transition before full economic transformation. We are experiencing aging at a much earlier point of the development process. And this is because of a very successful voluntary family planning program which was driven by the education of the girl child. The fact that the female or girls' participation in formal education was extremely high. They were then able to plan their families, and this was a very successful program. And we have started aging. So in a sense, we are almost paying a penalty for the success we've had in educating girls, in the sense that this whole aging process is hitting us at an earlier stage of our development trajectory, which means that there is a much higher premium placed on productivity improvements in terms of, you have to do the research and the innovation, everything that goes with productivity improvements have come at an earlier stage. So because we can't drive growth through labor augmentation anymore. So it has to be through productivity and at an earlier stage in the development process. So those are the three kind of, as I said, macro kind of challenges policymakers have been struggling to get their heads around. And it's a work in progress still. Okay, let me, the title says Frameworks for Macroeconomic Policy in a Pluralist Polity. And I think all the challenges that one has in terms of formulating macro policy have been compounded by the nature of politics in Sri Lanka. What has happened in Sri Lanka is that liberal political institutions at the time of independence were superimposed on what was and still is to a significant extent a semi-feudal society. I say semi-feudal because it is very much driven by patron-client relationships. And this has meant that almost all institutions have become politicized. There are other countries which have as venal, if not more venal, politicians than Sri Lanka has. But I doubt there are many countries where all the key institutions have been politicized as much as they have in Sri Lanka, whether it's the judiciary, the public administration, the press, everything. There is a significant degree of politicization. And the checks and balances have been reduced. And that also applies to macroeconomic policymaking. When push comes to shove, politics always trumps economics. And we have had really repeating cycles of stop-go policies. Sri Lanka has had 16 programs with the IMF since 1965. And at the heart of the problem is the government budget, the unsustainability of the government's budgetary operations. And the government's budgetary operations have been constrained by a very toxic combination of populist politics on the one hand and a deeply entrenched entitlement culture on the other. These two things have fed off each other. It's been a non-virtuous cycle which has dragged us down. And this is, I think, almost the key explanatory factor for the macroeconomic stress that the country has experienced for much of its post-independent years. In fact, if one were to caricaturize the Sri Lankan economy, for much of the time, it has been a high budget deficit, high inflation, high nominal interest rate, overvalued exchange rate economy. So diametrically the opposite to what the successful countries of East and Southeast Asia achieve. So this macroeconomic instability essentially, as I said, is stemming from the government's budgetary operations. I'll give a little bit more color to it later on when I come to fiscal policy. But one other point that I want to make is that so in this scenario, the fiscal imbalances also created excess aggregate demand, which leaked into imports, which meant that the country had a persistent current account deficit. So interestingly, if you look at the progress of the Sri Lankan economy, there's a strong correlation between the size of the budget deficit and the growth rate. In in East and Southeast Asia, it was a current account surplus that drove the growth. In Sri Lanka, it was the size of the budget deficit, which meant that it was unsustainable. And we had these sugar highs where governments would let go of the budget in a manner that was closely related to the electoral cycle. So each time there was an election, you have this slippage in fiscal policy, and a sugar high is created, and invariably you have an IMF program after the election, and some degree of stabilization then is achieved, and yet the cycle starts all over again as elections approach. So it was a question of creating sugar highs which were unsustainable from day one through overly accommodative fiscal and monetary policy, and then in the end, you basically had to go back to an IMF program and put in stabilization. Now, the other feature to note is that there has been a real challenge in synchronizing stabilization and structural reforms. As you know, stabilization packages compress domestic absorption and have a depressing effect on both consumption and demand, aggregate demand, and consumption and investment are both adversely affected. Now, the only way you can basically avoid a growth deficit is if you undertake the structural reforms. And clearly there is a time asymmetry. The stabilization measures hit very quickly. The structural reforms take more time to implement, but usually there hasn't been the political will to implement the structural reforms that were necessary to sustain the growth. So, whenever there has been elevated growth, it's been driven by unsustainable macro policy, particularly coming out of the government's budgetary operation. So that is the background against which I'm going to propose that it became important to have clear frameworks for macroeconomic policy making and to embed as much of those frameworks as possible in law. So that is what we intended to do or tried to do, and it was only partially successful. We ran out of parliamentary time, and as Tim indicated, there was a coalition government which made decision making more complex, and things took much longer than they perhaps should have done, and so we were not able to complete the story. But let me tell you about the journey we started on, but were not able to complete. So on fiscal policy, the government, at least the central bank, decided to adopt flexible inflation targeting. Now, obviously, the other options are an exchange rate, but in a country with a persistent current account deficit and low external reserves, clearly that is not sustainable, or at least creates a lot of compression in terms of economic activity. But for many years, the central bank used monetary aggregates as the anchor. But the relationship between inflation and the monetary aggregates weakened, and the decision was taken to adopt flexible inflation targeting. And a roadmap was formulated. The IMF provided technical assistance. So a data-driven forward-looking approach was adopted. The inflation target was 4 to 6%, but there was provision to change it. The finance minister could change the target and issue a gazette. As you know, the government issues gazettes to inform the public of key policy decisions that it takes, and the finance minister would be required to issue a gazette and explain why the inflation target was changed, if it was changed. And the technical capability for modeling and forecasting within the central bank was strengthened. And there were surveys conducted on inflation expectations amongst academics, amongst business people. and households. Then a new central bank bill was formulated to embed this inflation targeting framework in law. Because, we felt we really had to tie our hands. I think there is this famous story of Ulysses getting his men to tie his hands to the mast of his ship so that he wouldn't turn the steering wheel when they heard the singing of the sirens. And if they went in that direction, clearly there was disaster awaiting them. So to deny himself that temptation, he tied his hands to the mast. In the same way, we were trying to tie the hands of all of us policymakers through clear frameworks and them being embedded as much as possible in law. So this flexible inflation targeting framework was to be embedded into a new central bank bill, and the bill was drafted. And some of the key aspects of that bill were a bifurcation of the governance structure. For its initial 70 years, the central bank had one monetary board, which looked after everything, monetary policy, as well as the other responsibilities of the bank. Then the proposed bill actually bifurcated it to have a technical monetary policy board and a separate governance board. And the existing monetary board has the secretary to the treasury on it. And historically, the country's monetary policy has been severely constrained by fiscal forbearance. And so the idea was to have greater autonomy for monetary policy in the central bank by the proposed new law actually separating the central bank from the treasury, and the secretary of the treasury no longer being on the monetary policy board. He was on the governance board, but not on the monetary policy board, which was going to be much more of a technical board. Other things were that price stability was to be the primary objective. The central bank's current objectives are, these are the twin objectives of price and economic stability and financial system stability. But in the new bill, price stability was to be the primary objective, and financial system stability was to be in the core objective. And also, and this was key, in an attempt to reduce the prospects, or remove at least the prospects of acute fiscal forbearance, by preventing the central bank from participating in the primary auctions for government instruments. Because historically, the central bank has, and most recently too, has been buying a large amount of bills from the primary market. So that's been high-powered money creation. And that was to be prevented. Another important initiative was to have a whole new section in the draft bill on macroprudential surveillance. Clearly, after the global financial crisis, the importance of macroprudential surveillance as a means of identifying and taking proactive action on risks emerging in the economy gained increasing salience and importance, and therefore there was provision to strengthen macroprudential surveillance. And transparency would have been improved through an announcement of a medium-term policy framework and a desired inflation path. The communications was to have been improved, including through a biannual inflation report, and reforms basically that were proposed were based on the key pillars of increased autonomy and accountability. And in terms of accountability, the governor was to testify regularly to Parliament in the same way the Fed chairman testifies before Congress. That was to be introduced. Now, we got the bill into Parliament. It took a long time, much longer than we anticipated. Though it went into Parliament, we ran out of parliamentary time before the election took place. And the new government has decided that the kind of autonomy that was being proposed in this draft bill was not something that is appropriate for a country at Sri Lanka's stage of development. I mean, there is a case that can be made, but the thinking behind the new bill was to find ways and means of moving away from this macroeconomic stress that had been there for many, many years, and this accommodative monetary policy, which was characterized by fiscal forbearance, how to really get away from that and to kind of tie the hands of policymakers in such a way that they couldn't resort to it without breaking the law. So, so that's monetary policy. I should perhaps share one insight. I mean, you know, ideally one should not intervene in setting interest rates. You don't want to mess around with markets. But I think in countries like Sri Lanka, frontier markets, you have to be pragmatic as well. And one lesson we learned was that we had to intervene when it came to lending rates. In early 2019, it became clear that the economy was slowing down significantly. Private credit growth had come down. And the previous year, the government had been able to achieve a primary surplus. So the borrowing requirement was still high, but not as high as it had been historically. And there seemed to be scope to loosen monetary policy. So the central bank shifted from a neutral to a expansionary phase of monetary policy, and the SRR was reduced, policy rates were reduced, etc. While the benchmark interest rates in the market were coming down, lending rates in the banking system did not. So you had the whole yield curve on government securities coming down, the benchmark call money rates came down, but the lending rates were very high. So we had a situation where nominal growth was about 8%. The primary lending rate was 12%, and the average lending rate, weighted average lending rate, was about 14.5. Clearly, trying to do business in that kind of framework was not possible. So the Monetary Board decided to impose a deposit cap, because the bankers kept saying, no, we can't bring down lending rates because it's, we have to keep our deposit rates up because it's highly competitive, and we're not able to bring down our deposit rates. And therefore, our funding costs are high, and therefore our lending rates are high. So we said, okay, that's fine. Then we will put a cap on your deposit rates. And then after some months, once the funding costs began to come down as the deposits were renewed, we then imposed a target for the prime rate, the average weighted prime lending rate of 9.5%, I think, and the average weighted lending rate of about 12. So we actually did interfere in the market. And I think one needs to be ready to be pragmatic, because the problem was the transmission of monetary policy, and at that time was weak. And if that is the case, clearly one sometimes has to intervene. So that's a lesson we learned. On exchange rate policy, now under a flexible inflation targeting regime, the exchange rate clearly has to be the first line of defense for absorbing external shocks. So the exchange rate was allowed to move in line with the balance of inflows and outflows in the FX market. But the central bank did interfere, at least intervened in the market to prevent disorderly adjustment driven by changes in sentiments, which were not aligned with underlying market dynamics. Now, the FX market in Sri Lanka ranges from 60 to 100 million a day. So if, for instance, a bondholder or somebody who had equity wants to take money out and there was 20 million going out, that could disrupt the market. So there were times when, to smooth out disorderly adjustment, the central bank did intervene. But other than that, the exchange rate was allowed to move flexibly, reflecting the balance of inflows and outflows in the market. Now, before I move on to the fiscal side, I'd like to share another kind of rather sobering experience. And that is, I think, the instability that can be caused by capital flows, portfolio capital flowing into and out of rupee securities, government securities. Now, when I went into the central bank, there were, I think, about $3.1 billion worth of government securities, foreign money in government securities, foreign portfolio investment in government securities. Now, that money, as you know, is hot money, which goes in and out, sometimes due to domestic factors, but also due to exogenous factors. Because when the taper tantrum took place, money rushed out. When the US Fed changed its monetary policy stance, then risk appetite in global markets changed. And when that happened, money went out again, with nothing to do with what was happening in the underlying fundamentals in the Sri Lankan economy. And so, you know, our room to maneuver in setting one, monetary policy, and two, in setting our exchange policy, was severely constrained by this large amount of portfolio capital that was there in government rupee securities. Now, it was well-intentioned. The idea was to attract foreign savings. Anyway, we were constrained for foreign savings. So the idea was, okay, this is another source of foreign savings, let's bring it in. But it really did complicate exchange rate and interest rate policy. Exchange rate policy, because whenever large amounts of money went out, clearly, as I said, a market of 100 million, and there was this 3.1 billion, and this money was going, and we had crises. We had a political constitutional crisis. We had terrorist attack, the Easter bombings. Whenever these kind of things happen, money rushes out, and then you're basically pretty helpless. Either you have to let the exchange rate go, or you have to deplete your reserves. So having this large amount of money, foreign money in your rupee securities, particularly in a twin deficit country, because these are the most vulnerable. So each, not only in terms of domestic developments, which are understandable, but each time there's a change in risk appetite in the global markets, also money went in and out. And if you're a twin deficit country, you were the most vulnerable. So I think the lesson from that is, if you are a twin deficit country with limited reserves, trying to get large amounts of money into your foreign money into your government securities is fraught with danger. I'm not saying don't do it, but it's fraught with danger. And in fact, what we did was we reduced the limit for such investments from 12.5% of the total debt stock down to 5%. And I think now actually there's hardly anything left because of the risks associated with the Sri Lankan economy. And in paradoxically, that has made monetary and exchange rate policy easier to manage, because there were times when we wanted to bring the interest rate down, but we were constrained from doing so because we didn't want to compress the interest rate differential between the domestic rates and the U.S. Treasury rates. So it meant that it did reduce the leeway for the autonomy of monetary policy setting. And as I said, equally, the exchange rate was buffeted due to factors totally beyond totally outside the underlying fundamentals in the economy. Okay, let me get to the main source of instability in the system, and that is the government's fiscal operations. If you essentially, right now, it's atypical because of the pandemic, but last year, expenditure was 19-20% of GDP, which is okay when you come, in terms of our comparators. That level of expenditure is okay. And in fact, there are issues about the quality of public expenditure, but in terms of the level, it's okay. But the problem is that our revenue dropped to 9.2% of GDP, partly due to the pandemic and the fact that the economy contracted by 3.6% last year, but also because there were large-scale tax reductions by the incoming government in December of 2019. It was a kind of a Laffer curve rationale to it. And of course, they did not have the opportunity to see whether that would bring about the growth effects they anticipated because of the impact of the pandemic. But all in all, there is a massive now budget deficit, a double-digit budget deficit, and it's likely to be repeated this year. But even before the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic, as well as these tax reductions, there has been an underlying problem as far as government revenue has been concerned. Right up to the middle 90s, 95, 96, even 97, I think, revenue was about 19, 20% of GDP. And expenditure was 25, 26%. And, the deficit would go up and down. As I said, you have these cycles when linked to the budget, linked to the electoral cycle. But revenue actually came down from the mid 70s to, say, 2014 was the trough. It went down from this 19, 20% figure all the way down to 12%, to 12.5%. And that was because during the conflict, the 30-year conflict that Sri Lanka had, I should have mentioned part of the macroeconomic stress, of course, also has to be attributed to the conflict, the buildup of defense expenditure and the disruption to economic activity. All that also greatly complicated fiscal management. So that has to be factored in. So the revenue went down because one, the traditional sources of revenue, which were the Sri Lanka's traditional exports, that is tea, rubber, and coconut, those sectors generated large surpluses and were the main source of revenue. Taxes on those were the main source of revenue. But there has been a secular decline in the terms of trade. Surpluses, and also there has been an increase in the wages of the plantation workers, who are the most underprivileged, underdeveloped community in the country. And the margins have got squeezed, and the tax take from those sectors have reduced significantly. And the new sectors, the new growth sectors, like apparel, like tourism, don't pay tax. Because what essentially happened was, during the conflict, the government felt compelled to provide lots of tax concessions to ensure that projects would get over the hurdle rate of return. Because clearly there was a war risk premium attached to the economy, and you had to get the rate of return above that. And so they felt that the way to do it was to provide tax holidays. So these sectors, even after the war ended, it's once you give people tax holidays, it is not easy to take it away, and that problem is there. So the traditional sources of revenue have kind of dried up. The new sources are not paying tax, and there is a real structural problem. So a key reform has to be revenue enhancement based fiscal consolidation, and that's something the government is going to have to come to grips with once they get through the pandemic. And the economy resumes a more normal trajectory. But what was done in the previous period while I was in the central bank, this was of course the responsibility of the Treasury, was a great attempt was made to achieve a primary surplus in the budget. Now there have been only 4 years since 1955 that Sri Lanka has had a primary surplus in the budget. And 2 of those years were 2017 and 2018. You need a primary, because essentially what one says is that your revenue minus expenditure excluding interest has to be in surplus. because that is the way you're going to drive down your borrowing requirement and your future debt servicing. And so that was achieved. But again, in 2019, with elections approaching, it slipped. But an attempt was made to strengthen the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, which was introduced in, I think, 2003 or 4. But I think it had a target for debt to GDP and a budget deficit, I don't think it was ever met, actually. It was never met. So the idea was to give more teeth to the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, and debt to GDP was to have been the key target, with the primary budget balance being the operational target. And there were clear reasons set out in the proposed amendments to the Act, which would enable a breaching of the target. Things like disaster relief or counter-cyclical policy to address severe recessions like what we are experiencing now. So that was, again, a way of setting a framework and embedding it in law. Let me quickly come, I'm way behind. Let me rush a bit. Debt management. Sri Lanka's debt to GDP right now is about 109%. It's very much an outlier, even for frontier market economies. These economies have seen their debt to GDP go up significantly, but Sri Lanka is an outlier as far as having a debt to GDP of 109%. And even before, this was a problem. Even before the pandemic, Sri Lanka's debt to GDP ratio was very much an outlier. And two things were done to try to, again, come up with frameworks embedded in law. One was the passage of the Active Liability Management Act. Now, historically, the government's borrowing requirement was limited to what was set out in the Appropriation Act, which was passed by Parliament each year. You couldn't borrow more than that. What the Active Liability Management Act did was to enable borrowings over and above what was set out in the Appropriation Act for the specific purpose of debt management. So you could go to the market opportunistically when the conditions were right and borrow money, set it aside, and employ techniques like switching and refinancing, and there are various techniques that are available for liability management. And the idea was to really strengthen debt management by enabling the use of such instruments and enabling and creating the space to do that through the Active Liability Management Act. But so that parliamentary oversight of public finance was not undermined in any way, each of these operations had to be approved by Parliament. The other component of the debt management framework is the medium-term debt management strategy, which was published in April 2019. And here, the priorities were a gradual reduction in foreign borrowing and an extension of maturities and a winding down of short-term borrowings, swaps and other short-term borrowings, to improve essentially the maturity profile and the cost of external debt. And the intention was through these two mechanisms to improve the capacity for liability for debt management. Now, the other thing I had down here was, clearly this is the macro side. You have to also, there was one other thing. We drafted a new banking act, which is in the it's I think about to be finalized, which sought to strengthen corporate governance, consolidated supervision, put in place a much stronger resolution framework, enable the central bank as a regulator to impose monetary penalties and fines. It enabled the ring fencing to mitigate contagion risk, strengthen provisions for mergers, acquisitions, and consolidation, and strengthen the provisions for subsidiarization of large foreign banks. So those were the things that were put into the new proposed banking bill. It's still a bill, but that I think is going to go through, and it's a work in progress. So those were some of the things that were done. And as I said, all this is to create a foundation for growth, for strengthening growth framework. You're the growth lab. And as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, your colleagues who worked on Sri Lanka will know there's a lot to do, whether it's the factor markets, the ease of doing business, investment promotion, trade policy, including trade agreements, trade facilitation, education, training, skills development, energy security, R&D, innovation, entrepreneurship, having a better targeted and more effective social safety net. All those things, to support the growth framework, all those things are necessary. And the final point I'd like to make is related to the international dimension. Sri Lanka's location is strategically very important. It's placed on some of a key major trade route. I think, I can't remember now, something like 60-70% of the world's oil passes within 20 kilometers of Sri Lanka. I think there's some number like that. I'm not sure whether that's the right number, but it is a key strategic location. And with an increasingly multipolar world, Sri Lanka has, in my view, a greater potential to leverage the dynamics of the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean region to its advantage. But there are some rules of the game that need to be observed. Sri Lanka is 20 miles off the coast of India. We are within India's defense perimeter. And India's foreign policy basically has been, as long as there is no third-party footprint of a strategic nature in Sri Lanka, they basically let us do what we want to do. If there is any such doubt in their minds, they're quite capable of destabilizing the country, which they have done in the past. So, Shiv Shankar Menon, who was a former foreign secretary and national security advisor, an extremely thoughtful man, in his book writes, Sri Lanka is like an unsinkable aircraft carrier parked 20 miles off the coast of India. So that is the mindset of the Indian strategic establishment. So we need to keep that in mind. So whatever we do, we need to remember that we are within India's defense perimeter. And there's a real opportunity, because I think President Biden at the G7 summit spoke about this, the competition of ideas, the competition of democracies versus more illiberal systems. And India, because of that competition, I think is going to get a pretty strong tailwind. I see very recently the Australians have sent ex-Prime Minister Abbott to negotiate a fast-track trade agreement with the Indians. So I think, India, I suspect, after the pandemic, will enjoy a period of rapid growth, and they have their demographics in their favor as well. And Sri Lanka, and the possibility exists for India to do for the South Asian region what the rise of Japan and then China did for the East and Southeast Asian region. And India's now neighborhood first policy, which they have, I think, given greater prominence to after China's entry into the region, means that there is a possibility of Sri Lanka essentially piggybacking on India's future growth. And this becomes more possible, in terms of supply chains, etc., penetrating supply chains, because historically, though we've had proximity for millennia, the infrastructure in both countries has been so bad that the transaction costs of doing business across the border was very, very high. Now, ports, airports, roads are all improving in both countries. So it becomes much more possible for Sri Lanka to take advantage of what's going on in India. China, has been a very good friend of Sri Lanka for many years. It stems from the fact that way back in 1952, Sri Lanka signed the Rubber Rice Pact. We sold rubber for rice from China. at a time when the Chinese, relatively new Chinese communist regime was ostracized by many of the major powers. And the Chinese have never forgotten that. And so they have been very generous to Sri Lanka. And even during the conflict, when the West was concerned about human rights abuses and was not selling arms to Sri Lanka, the Chinese provided support. And so there is a close relationship. But this Chinese debt trap narrative is unfounded because Sri Lanka's debt to China is less than 10%. It's about 9 to 10% of the total debt stock. And Japan has 11, and the multilaterals have much higher. ADB and World Bank have higher shares of the debt stock. The Chinese debt stock was increasing rapidly, but in terms of the totals, share of the total, it's still low. And now the government of Sri Lanka has decided, because of its debt dynamics, to pivot from loans to equity. So hopefully those concerns around the world can be allayed. And Japan, again, has been a very, very firm ally for Sri Lanka. They have been the #1 bilateral donor for many years, until the last, say, about 10 years, when China emerged as the #1 bilateral donor. So, as I said, we need to balance and of course, the US and Europe are our primary markets. 60% of our exports go to these two markets. So that's key. And vast proportion of our bonds, our international sovereign bonds, are held by Western, particularly American, fund managers. So there are very strong economic links between all the major powers in the country and Sri Lanka. And what we need to do is basically leverage our strategic position and to be neutral enough to benefit from all these relationships. We need to be agile and smart. It can be done, and it's an opportunity. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I've taken so long.
Thank you so much, Indrajit. You packed a lot of wisdom into those minutes, and we're getting a lot of questions coming in. So I'd like to take the liberty of asking you one or two, and then open it up to others.
Sure.
So my first question is from experience of working with other countries, we see a lot that are in similar types of macroeconomic predicaments to the ones you faced in Sri Lanka, especially where the timing, the pace, and the sequencing of reforms matters. It's often overlooked, right, that when you have multiple distortions, pulling one lever can make others worse. So you might know the new macro equilibrium that you want to face, but you don't necessarily know the exact path to get there. And typically, IMF programs don't provide a lot of space for you to figure it out. And then that's before the politics of the reforms even come in. So I'm really interested to hear you just speak a little bit more about those challenges, how you faced them, what you learned, and if you have any advice for us at the Growth Lab and similar organizations that try to help policymakers like you navigate these things in real time.
So clearly, in fact, I should have mentioned this, it's critical. And this is something we have also struggled with in terms of, certainly in terms of trade policy, the particular area where, how one sequences that in terms of liberalization, in terms of the speed at which one does that, trade agreements, who we do it with, and what should be the kind of special and differential treatment we should get from some of the larger countries like India and China with whom we are negotiating. So there are issues like that. On the macro side, where one has to be careful clearly is the fiscal monetary coordination, in the sense that right now, of course, is a clear example where I think you have to essentially open the spigots, both on the fiscal side, on the monetary side, because of the great demand compression that's taking place due to the pandemic. But historically in Sri Lanka, we have not got it right. Monetary policy has not lent into over-expansionary fiscal policy. There has been fiscal forbearance, which has amplified the macroeconomic stress. So that was one thing as to how you essentially, the timing of your monetary policy actions and how you how that complements fiscal policy. It's something I think that has to be carefully calibrated, and we were not that good at doing it, to be honest. That was one of the biggest problems. And the idea of trying to build in greater autonomy for the central bank was to have greater scope to do so. That you could have an autonomous monetary policy which would either lean into expansionary fiscal policy, or if there was a growth deficit, then to basically have a more expansionary monetary policy, more aggressive monetary policy. So that's where it really played in terms of the timing and the speed at which you did things was really to make sure that the fiscal monetary coordination worked well. But as I said, there were lots of other issues in terms of reforms of land and labor markets. How you put together a reform program. Clearly, given this kind of electoral cycle that we have and the political culture, you have to do your tough reforms up front. Right? You have to pick what you're going to do, probably not too many because you're not going to get all of it done in our kind of system. So do you want to do some labor market reforms? Do you want to land, whatever? You have to pick 2-3 things in terms of factor markets. I think the business climate stuff is a continuous agenda, right? That you can keep pressing on as much as you can. Again, on trade policy, there are choices to be made in terms of speed and the sequencing of it as to who you do trade deals with. Because ideally, we did one with Singapore, which again got messed up because of the coalition. But when you're doing reforms, you have to maybe pick the tough ones, yes, early in the political cycle. But at the same time, you need to pick some low-hanging fruit so you can show some results. I think that's important so that the reform program does gain some credibility within the first year or two of a government. So that you can show some results. So it's a mix, I guess. So when you're putting, what am I saying? I'm saying is, when you're putting the structural reform program together, if you have a very high, if you're attaching a very high priority to a tough reform, do it as early as possible in the political cycle. At the same time, pick a couple of low-hanging fruit, which help you to show some results fairly early on in the process, so that the reform program gains credibility.
Thank you. So I just have one more question, and then I'll bring in some others. And this question's turning away from the technical policy questions and more towards building an effective organization. So I know that you put a major focus on expanding the capabilities of the bank, and you had a deep understanding and appreciation for the importance of individuals in the system, and you cared about their individual professional growth. So I was wondering if you could share any examples of successes you had while at the bank and what you observed in terms of the teams that you had to build to put it together. And if you have any insights that you'd pass along to other leaders that might be taking on similar positions in other places that you might not have known when you started, but learned through this process of leading the central bank.
I think this applies to most central banks, but the Central Bank of Sri Lanka has a highly qualified and professional cadre. As you know, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka went through some difficulties. We had some things that affected our reputation. So early on, one had to deal with some of that stuff. But what was interesting was that even more than me, the staff of the central bank were very keen to restore the reputation of the institution. They wanted to work very professionally. So in a way, I was working in a very kind of what's the word for it? The playing field was very conducive in the sense that the staff wanted to be professional, the staff were qualified, and they wanted to really deliver the kind of outcomes one expected from them. I must give credit to one of my predecessors, that's Nivad Cabral, who's now the state minister in the Ministry of Finance. He ramped up the postgraduate training program. So the number of PhDs increased, thanks to him. It started then, but it increased in the time I was there, and it will continue to increase. So the academic training that is being built into the human resources in the bank, I think has been a good thing. And I think that has been very important in contributing to the quality of the work that they do. The other thing is, I must say, now I'm having a senior moment, that the famous head of General Electric, anyway, I can't remember. One of his key sayings was that, as the CEO, intervene only where you think you can make a difference, and where there is a problem which needs to be put right, or there is a growth path that needs to be pushed, but let the organization run itself. And I must say, to a significant extent, because it was a highly professional organization, I let the deputy governors run their patches very much, but engaged only in the big policy issues, really. Or if they had a problem, if they came to me with a problem. So that was the style that I tried to adopt in terms of managing the institution. An institution, which I said is full of qualified and very able people, because even when it comes to recruitment, the central bank tends to recruit very rigorously and then trains, as I said. So, yeah, I mean, that was my philosophy. They themselves wanted to be professional. I let the deputy governors pretty much run their patches and try to focus on the major policy issues. And the biggest challenge was to make sure that politics didn't come in through the door. That was my job, to ensure that the policies of the central bank were not affected by political factors. Given the history of our country, yeah.
Great, thank you. So at this point, I think we want to put Ricardo on video and ask him to share any thoughts and questions he has.
To start, it says, hi.
Hi, Ricardo.
Hi, Indrajit. For some reason, it says here, unable to start video. I don't know if I'm being blocked.
It'd be nice to see you.
No, but I'm eager to start my video. In any case, it's great to see you. Sorry you can't see me. I'm always.
There you are. There you are. Good.
Always impressed by your wisdom, your knowledge, your ability to synthesize and communicate. And I have vivid memories of our conversations in your beautiful office overseeing the port of Colombo, your talk brought me back to the early moments of the reform of the government when it was made, the decision was made to go to an IMF program that was revenue based, to raise revenues and so on. And so this, which I'm going to make a comment to it, you might, in Tim O'Brien's question, there was this issue of political economy. And I wonder if a sustainable reform is a reform that allows the government to be re-elected so that it can continue. And I wonder if I was fully in support of a revenue-based adjustment program, but many revenue-based adjustment programs don't get re-elected. and revenues become the political issue in the campaign and the promise of the opposing party. So I leave that as a comment. But you mentioned that you decided to go in the direction of inflation targeting, which is very interesting, and particular in some of the countries we have worked in over the years. In Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile are all inflation targeters, and they had a much easier time managing COVID from a monetary point of view than the ones that had more rigid exchange rates. But obviously, inflation targeting means exchange rate fluctuation, and exchange rate fluctuations are deeply political, and they generate winners and losers. So I wanted, my first question is how does the politics of exchange rate work in Sri Lanka? And in some countries, the export sector is highly diversified and very broad, so they don't mind depreciations, but others have debts in dollars. Or our imports affect the cost of living. So that's question one. So like the political economy of exchange rates and inflation targeting. Secondly is you defined a set of rules in the macro thing. I thought that maybe the thing that it's always, we wish we knew how to do it, but it's hard to put the devil in a box, is some fiscal rules, right? That because in the end, if the fisc has too large a deficit, then it generates fiscal dominance over monetary policy and generates the twin deficits. It generates so. Any thoughts on should we abandon the idea of tying up the Leviathan, or is there, who would enforce such rules on the government if the government is the one that wants to spend and so on? But in a macro framework, is there a role for fiscal rules? And this comes to my third question. So right now you mentioned several numbers that look very worrisome. The first one is that the debt is already at 109% of GDP, and that the interest rate on the debt is greater than the growth rate by a significant amount, say 3 percentage points or more. So that means that you already need that the interest burden is at least 3 percentage points of GDP. And so in a country that has trouble generating a primary surplus. So it would suggest that the writing is on the wall, that interest rates are already telling you that the position is somewhat unsustainable, and that the markets would calm down if they see a path towards fiscal adjustment. And I wonder, is there a path towards fiscal adjustment, or are we in for another sudden stop or another stop-go? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo, and so, yeah, really very, very nice to see you again. I must tell you on your first observation, question about I would say that in terms of the reform process, I keep at the end of my period, I ask myself, what is the kind of, how would I grade it? And the famous saying, "Operation successful, but the patient died," because the government lost the election, as you intimated. When you have fiscal consolidation based largely on revenue, that can happen, and that did happen. Because if you looked at the macro indicators, if you looked at inflation, if you looked at reserves, if you look at the current account deficit, and even the currency in 2019, the year of the election, actually appreciated by 0.5%. So a lot of the indicators were in the right place, but growth was 2.3%. That was the issue. As I said, that's why I said it becomes so crucial that if you are going to have a stabilization program, you have to really push very, very hard on the structural stuff so that you don't end up with this, Operation Successful Patient Died now. On the political economy of the exchange rate, in Sri Lanka, it's extremely political because the import component of the basic consumption bundle is very high in Sri Lanka. It's a small open economy. And so the exchange rate does impact the cost of living, not as much as it used to, because in the past we used to import quite a lot of our rice requirement, our staple food requirement. But now the country is pretty much self-sufficient. There is, unless there is some weather disturbance, there are no rice imports. And so that has really given greater room to maneuver as far as the exchange rate is concerned. But still, oil is imported, wheat is imported, and in urban areas, a lot of bread is eaten, pharmaceuticals. So the exchange rate is extremely political. So when you point the impossible trinity out to politicians, they say okay, let's increase the interest rate. Forget about the exchange rate, leave that alone. Let's increase the interest rate. But actually, that ends up being a triple whammy to growth in the economy, which is what they are looking for as well. Because if you have an overvalued exchange rate, essentially you're subsidizing foreign producers at the expense of your own producers. Exporters are disadvantaged, and import competing goods and services producers are also disadvantaged. So there's a hit to growth through an overvalued exchange rate. And then by holding the exchange rate, if you let interest rates go higher than they would have done otherwise, if you had a more balanced policy stance, then the cost of funding in the economy goes up. So really, I remember one of my macroeconomic tutors at university used to say, don't be a one club golfer. Use all the instruments at your disposal. And I think we need to balance it out. And but you're right, the exchange rate is extremely political. Governments would want you to do anything other than depreciate the currency. Right at the moment, the central bank has told the banks that they cannot sell dollars at more than $203, 203 rupees to a dollar. But the parallel market rate is way, way above that. But I don't know how long they can hold it. But the reason why they're doing it is, again, as you very correctly suggested, is a highly political nature of the exchange rate. On the fiscal rules, I think somehow one has to convince our political masters of the need for it. Because as I said, Sri Lanka, right now, we are all the independent analysts, the rating agencies, the research notes coming out of financial institutions, all are flashing red, saying that there could well be a train crash further down the line. The only way to get out of that is really to have a clear framework, and to embed it in the law. As I said, the old Ulysses story of somehow we have to convince our political masters that it's in their interest to tie their own hands. Now, what I don't know is whether we would need to have a catastrophe before they learn that lesson or not. That is to be seen, and we will know fairly soon. Because if we don't, one option for them, they have two options: either to be bankrolled by bilateral friend, which is basically China and India, or they have to go to the IMF. If they go to the IMF, there will be again revenue enhancement based fiscal consolidation that will be necessary because revenue has already collapsed. So I think there have to be fiscal rules. We have to work hard at explaining it to the people also and to the politicians. I think we need more bottom-up pressure. One of the lessons that I learned is that you have to create awareness and have bottom-up pressure for the politicians to react on the independent, on the central banking bill, on the fiscal rules, all those things. We were talking amongst ourselves. We're talking to the think tanks and the academics, but not enough to the person on the street to explain this. And if I had to do things again, that is something I would have given much more attention to explain things like why we need fiscal rules, why we are an outlier when it comes to debt and deficit. So how do we get over that? We are an outlier when it comes to being a twin deficit country. How do we get over that? So some of that, I mean, I think the only way to do it is to raise awareness amongst the people. And Sri Lanka is a relatively well-educated population, so one can do that, and to bring about bottom-up pressure, and that's the only way I think one can get politicians to respond. And of course, once you have fiscal rules, rent-seeking opportunities also come down. That's another problem for them. So, yeah, I mean, I think definitely we need fiscal rules. The question is, how does one navigate the process towards getting them accepted by our political leaders? Then on the debt trajectory, I remember listening to you on a webinar you did for some Sri Lankans, that the interest to revenue ratio is crucial. Well, the interest to revenue is now 70%. So that as you would emphasize, is an exorbitantly high number. So we have to find a way of having a primary surplus. The new Inland Revenue Act introduced by the previous government, which has now been overturned, shifted from tax holidays to investment allowances. And I too personally believe upfront investment allowances linked to capital formation are a better way of providing incentives than these kind of open-ended fiscal, open-ended tax holidays. So you're right. I mean, we are on a fiscal path that has to be adjusted and adjusted dramatically. I think, in my view, unless China and India are willing to write big checks, which I don't think they will, we will have to go to the IMF. What we will have to do, though, is to negotiate a trajectory of fiscal adjustment which takes into account the effects of the pandemic. I hope they will show enough flexibility for that fiscal adjustment to be backloaded much more than they would otherwise allow. I don't know whether I've responded to your questions, Ricardo.
Yes, absolutely. No, and very thoughtful. And there are many, many other questions that people are waiting to ask you. So thank you for your answer, and let's pick it up after.
I hope we meet in Colombo soon at some point.
Inshallah. Okay.
Right, as Ricardo said, there's a bunch of questions coming in, so time is running low. I think we'll try to squeeze in two more. First, I'm going to ask Tarawaki Fuji. Apologies if I mispronounce your name, but I hope you can introduce yourself as you come on video and ask Indrajit your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, can see you and hear you. Hi.
Doctor, thank you very much. Thank you very much for very interesting presentation. And I have a question about financial inclusion in SME in Sri Lanka. And I think you, according to explanation, lending rate currently decreased by government intervention. And so I think, and are there any challenges for financial inclusion in SME. And for example, I think, and in some countries, in developing countries where I work, I think they have a same problem. For example, like SME faced a very high interest rate, so they could not access to a proper finance. So, and if central government of Sri Lanka had some intervention to address the financial inclusion in Sri Lanka, I appreciate your explanation, because I think those, your explanation might be very helpful for other country too. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. No, certainly it's a problem. MSME financing has been a big challenge. There is a national financial inclusion strategy that was finalized maybe a year and a half ago, and a big component of that is focused on MSME financing. Now, I should say, the interest rates I was giving you were interest rates in 2019. Since the pandemic hit, the central bank has brought policy rates down about 350 basis points, and lending rates have come down. The prime lending rate, which we were targeting 9.5%, has now come down to about 5.75%. So lending rates have come down significantly. In addition, as a response to the pandemic, because of a lack of fiscal space, the government has not been able to provide fiscal interventions to support kind of livelihoods and businesses. So the banking system has had to carry much of the load, and we were fortunate because we actually went very robustly ahead with the implementation of the Basel Accords. In fact, there was a question mark whether the central bank was actually cramping economic growth by pushing the Basel standards so vigorously. If we hadn't done that, and if there weren't buffers in the banking system, we would have been in serious trouble, because it is the banking system that has carried the load in terms of supporting, as I said, businesses and livelihoods. And so there have been a couple of special programs that have been introduced. One, an interest subsidy program, and another, a program based on a central bank guarantee, which are targeted primarily towards the MSME sector. But I must tell you, in Sri Lanka over the years, we've had a strong orientation towards trying to support the MSME sector. 70% of the enterprises, businesses in Sri Lanka are MSMEs. So, that's a very, very large component and of the economy, and about almost 50% of the workforce is in the MSME sector. But the experience of all the programs in Sri Lanka demonstrate that there are probably 4 areas you have to operate in terms of government support. One is training, whether it's entrepreneurship or whether it is basic bookkeeping, or whether it is if it's some kind of skilled activity, the imparting the necessary skills. So that's training. Second is inputs. I mean, if you're promoting poultry, then you have to make sure that poultry keeping, you have to make sure that the chicks are available. If it's like livestock, that the cattle or goats or whatever it is are available. So inputs are important. Third is finance, clearly important. But central bank, the Sri Lanka, through the central bank often, has had a number of financing schemes. But the biggest constraint is marketing. There have been numerous programs, and we've seen these enterprises set up, and they don't last because the marketing channels are not clear. And if you can actually clear the marketing channels and work backwards, then, if a bank knows that you have a marketing channel, you won't have any difficulty in getting financing. So that is, I think, where more work needs to be done, and more work is beginning to be done in Sri Lanka. There is now a better understanding that you have to hook these people up either to their local supply chains in terms of their local markets, or the regional supply chains, the national supply chains, and if possible to international supply chains. You also have to improve rural transport, rural roads rather. And in Sri Lanka, post-harvest losses are around 35 to 40%. That's an eye-watering number. So we need to improve the storage capabilities, the cold chain, transport, all those things. So everything related to the marketing component, and I think the way to go about it is to really look at these supply chains and see whether we can hook these MSMEs up into the supply chains. And then as part of the National Financial Inclusion Strategy, some of these things have been picked up. We now have to implement them. Is that okay?
I think you've answered that question very well, Indrajit. So we're running really low on time, but I want to combine just a couple more, and apologies to everybody who didn't get their questions answered. Sorry, and apologies for a hard question at the end. But several people are asking really about planning for the future and COVID-19. So Priyanka Krishnamurthy asks about, given the pressures of COVID, upcoming debt obligations, lack of Forex inflows, little access to international debt markets. Her question is about how should governments be thinking about soft sovereign debt defaults at this point? And along similar lines, John Soilu, seeing the same pressures, wanted to ask about how governments should be thinking about inflation, and in this time and place, should governments be more lenient or less tolerant toward inflation? Any thoughts you have on these before we close would be appreciated.
Okay. So on whether or not there should be a soft default, I think these are my own personal views, but the central bank of Sri Lanka and the government of Sri Lanka have said there is no way they will ever consider defaulting, and they are very proud of their unblemished record of debt servicing. They haven't missed a single payment, and this has been a great selling point for us. And if we were to deviate from that, clearly there will be reputational damage. But purely from a personal perspective, the question that I'm asking myself is, in order to remain current with our debt repayments. Now, we've just settled an international sovereign bond of $1 billion last month. But in order to do that, we've had to impose a number of import restrictions. And those are scarring the economy. It's quite clear. There is quite a lot of scarring going on. So what I think the authorities need to work out is, are we going to pay creditors 100 cents in the dollar when they've already discounted the debt, further down the yield curve to even below 60, I think. So if they're willing to accept that, should we scar the economy to pay them the full amount, the face value? So that's the question one needs to ask. The other thing is, what does one lose if one does a soft default? One is, of course, market access. However, due to the pre-existing challenges and then the tax cuts as well as the effects of the pandemic, Sri Lanka was downgraded and we no longer have access to capital markets. So the biggest downside of a soft default would, of course, be loss to capital markets for a period of time. Now, if you don't have market access, and it's unlikely we'll get a market access immediately, that downside is no longer there. So then, as I said, what the authorities need to figure out is it worth scarring the economy to the extent that we are in order to stay current on the debt? And if we do stay current, what are we benefiting? If Sri Lanka's debt service payments are about 4 billion USD, external debt payments, about 4 billion USD per year over the next 5 years. So if one does a soft default, you might be able to save a couple of billion, because about $1 billion is multilateral debt servicing, so you can't touch that. And the rest of it is bilateral and commercial debt. So you might, you could possibly save a couple of $1 billion for 2-3 years at the beginning, which will provide some oxygen for the economy to recover from the pandemic. So that's a calculation I think the authorities probably are thinking about. I mean, I don't know. But up to now, they've said that they are determined to meet their obligation. And the fact that they service the ISB despite all the challenges, despite the painful measures they've had to take. They settled the 1 billion in June. They settled another 1 billion in October last year. So people can't think that the Sri Lankan authorities have a frivolous attitude to their obligations. So having established that kind of commitment and willingness to pay, hopefully that creates a little bit more space to have a soft default and still be able to go back to the markets relatively quickly after that. But of course, in order to do all this, you would have to have an IMF program. I don't think it'll be possible even to have a soft default without some kind of IMF program in place. But let it be clear, the central bank and the government has said so far, they will meet all their commitments. I'm just saying some of the issues that are at play that need to be thought about.
Well, Indrajit, thank you so much for your
Oh, I'm
words.
sorry. There was a question on inflation, right? Sorry. Do you want me to answer that?
Oh, I was going to give you a pass on it, but if you'd like to, go ahead.
Okay. No, I mean, I think in the Sri Lanka is saying exactly what the other central banks are saying, that this is transitory. A lot of it is due to supply restrictions through the import controls, and that it will be transient. But the thing is transitory, but the thing is, if, in quotes, transitory inflation persists for a while, then inflation expectations change. Wage pressures come. And then it's no longer a supply-driven transitory price elevation. You then come to the kind of demand side of the problem. So a lot is going to depend on how long this, in quotes, transitory inflation carries on for. If it carries on for a period of time, I think then you need to start worrying.
Thank you, Indrajit. Thank you for answering all these questions, coming at you from all directions, and even for staying on with us past time. I've really learned a lot and appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us. So for everyone else, the Development Talk series will continue. Thank you for joining us, and you can keep up to date on the next events through social media and on our website. So thank you once again, Indrajit, and look forward to seeing you in person sometime again soon.
Hope so. I look forward to that very much. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to all of you. Bye.
Bye.